On a frigid October night in 1987, deep in the heart of Kentucky's Cumberland Mountains, 10 armed men vanished into the darkness carrying hunting rifles and a thirst for vengeance that would soon paint the hollows red with blood. By the time the sun crested over Black Mountain the following morning, 14 souls lay scattered across 12 square miles of Appalachian wilderness, each one eliminated with the cold precision of a military operation. This wasn't some random act of violence or drug-fueled rampage. This was something far more chilling. A systematic hunt orchestrated by the Turner family, a father and his sons who believed that mountain justice trumped federal law, and that some debts could only be paid in blood. If you think you're ready to hear this story, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But I'm warning you right now, what you're about to hear contains graphic violence and disturbing content based on real events that shook rural America to its core. The year 1987 found Harlan County, Kentucky, drowning in economic despair. Once a thriving coal region that employed thousands of hardworking men, the county had become a graveyard of abandoned mines and broken dreams. Unemployment had skyrocketed to devastating levels as the coal industry collapsed, leaving entire families without income or hope. The population was hemorrhaging as young people fled to cities, abandoning their ancestral homes for any chance at a decent living. In this economic wasteland, where legitimate work had become as scarce as hen's teeth, some families turned to the oldest tradition these mountains knew. Moonshining wasn't just about making illegal liquor. It was about survival, about feeding your children when there were no other options left, about maintaining some semblance of dignity in a world that had forgotten places like Harlan County existed. The Cumberland Mountains provided everything a moonshiner needed. Hidden valleys where law enforcement rarely ventured, crystal-clear spring water perfect for distillation, and a network of back roads known only to locals who had walked these ridges for generations. The nearest state police barracks sat 40 miles away, and the sheriff's department was understaffed and overwhelmed. In Harlan County, the law was more suggestion than reality. Daniel Robert Turner understood this harsh landscape better than most. At 54 years old, he carried himself like a man who had seen the worst life could offer and survived to tell about it. His body bore the scars of 3 decades spent crawling through coal seams barely 4 feet high, his hands permanently stained black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, a permanent reminder of the 1971 roof collapse that killed 2 men standing right beside him. Every morning, Daniel followed the same ritual. He would rise before dawn, brew coffee in a battered percolator, and sit at his kitchen table reading from the same King James Bible his mother had given him decades earlier. After finishing one chapter and smoking a single unfiltered cigarette, he would step outside to watch the sun emerge over Black Mountain, breathing in air that smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. Daniel had married Martha Jean Howard in 1955, and together they had raised 6 sons in a small house that had witnessed both joy and heartbreak. Martha, now 53, had the worn face of a woman who had buried brothers in mining accidents and watched her hometown slowly die around her. She lived with the constant fear that her husband and sons were one informant away from federal prison, but she also understood that moonshine was the only thing keeping food on their table. What Daniel valued most wasn't the money their operation brought in, though heaven knew they needed every dollar. What mattered to him was the principle that a man could still carve out his own path in a world increasingly dominated by government regulations and corporate overlords. His grandfather had made shine during Prohibition, his father during the Great Depression. Daniel saw it as inheritance, tradition, and survival, all distilled into the clear liquid that dripped from copper coils drop by precious drop. The still itself represented everything Daniel held sacred, It had cost him $15,000, assembled piece by piece over 2 years of careful planning and back-breaking work. That copper equipment wasn't just machinery to him. It was his family's future, his declaration of independence from a system that had abandoned men like him, his defiance against a world that had taken everything else. 4 miles east, near the old Clovertown mining camp, lived the Garrett family. Tommy Lee Garrett was 38 years old, built thick and strong despite missing 2 fingers on his right hand, lost to a conveyor belt accident that had nearly claimed his arm. He ran a small mechanics shop out of his garage, fixing trucks and farm equipment for cash. No receipts, no questions asked. His younger brothers all scraped by with odd jobs and determination, survivors in the ruins of coal country's collapse. These weren't career criminals or organized gangsters. They were neighbors in the truest Appalachian sense, men who had grown up in the same hollows, attended the same schools, and worked the same mines until the mines shut down forever. Tommy's wife, Susan, had been a few years behind Martha Turner in high school. Their families had never been close, separated by 4 miles of mountain terrain and different church affiliations, but they weren't enemies either. They were simply 2 families trying to survive in a place that seemed determined to crush anyone who stayed. Tommy's father had dabbled in moonshine work back in the 60s until federal agents caught him, and he served 18 months in prison. Tommy had sworn he would never touch the business. The risk was too great, the consequences too severe. But principles become luxuries when you're watching your family slide deeper into poverty every month. His oldest son needed dental work they couldn't afford. His daughter dreamed of attending community college. When you're faced with choices like that, moral stands start to feel like indulgences you can't justify. Word traveled through Harlan County like water running downhill. Everyone knew who had money, who had equipment, and who might be persuaded to part with either for the right price. The Turner still was legendary throughout the region. Custom built with a 300-gallon capacity, it was worth $15,000 easily, maybe $20,000 to the right buyer. To someone like Tommy Garrett, that still represented a way out of the trap that had snared so many mountain families. On the night of October 9, 1987, Daniel Turner's world changed forever. He had checked his operation at sunset, everything running smoothly, the mash fermenting perfectly, security tight. When he returned at dawn the next morning, the clearing where his still had operated was empty. Not just the main equipment, but every piece of copper, every coil, every thermometer, every collection jar. 2 years of work and $15,000 in investment had vanished like morning mist. Daniel stood in that empty clearing for 20 minutes, his breathing coming in short, sharp bursts, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The rectangular patch of flattened grass where his still had been looked like a grave. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. It was the death of his family's livelihood, the destruction of everything he had worked to build, the ultimate violation of the mountain code that said you never, ever stole from a neighbor's family. When Daniel finally walked back to his truck, his mind had already made the calculations that would seal 14 men's fates. There were only 3 families in Harlan County who knew the location of that still. Only 3 families with the trucks and manpower needed to move 300 pounds of equipment through dense forest in the middle of the night. And one of those families, the Garretts, had been asking suspicious questions about copper prices at the scrapyard 2 weeks earlier. The confrontation that would trigger everything came on October 10th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Daniel drove his pickup into the parking lot of Tommy Garrett's mechanic shop, where Tommy was working under a Chevrolet truck, the screaming of his impact wrench echoing off the garage walls. Daniel waited patiently until Tommy rolled out on his creeper board and saw the boots standing beside his toolbox. The conversation was brief and deadly. Daniel asked about his missing still. Tommy denied any knowledge. Daniel gave him until sundown on October 11th to return what belonged to the Turner family. The ultimatum hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, and 3 witnesses heard every word. That conversation spread through Harland County within hours, carrying with it the electric tension that comes before storms break and violence erupts. Everyone knew the Turners and Garretts were headed for serious trouble, but most folks figured it would blow over like these things usually did. Most mountain feuds ended with harsh words and hurt feelings, not bloodshed. They were wrong. The deadline came and went like a stone dropping into dark water. October 11th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Daniel Turner stood on his front porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains, and that copper still remained gone. No truck pulled into his driveway. No phone call came with an apology. No Garrett brother appeared to make things right. Just silence and the slow understanding that Tommy Garrett had made his choice. Martha appeared in the doorway behind him, drying her hands on a dish towel she'd been using since their wedding day. Her voice carried the weight of 32 years of marriage when she said, "Maybe they don't have it, Daniel. Maybe you're wrong about this whole thing." Daniel didn't turn around. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where darkness was swallowing the last traces of daylight. "I'm not wrong." "Then call the sheriff. Let the law handle it proper. Sheriff's 40 miles away, Martha. By the time he drives out here, takes statements, files his paperwork if he even bothers, that still will be melted down and sold for scrap metal in Cincinnati." He finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "Besides, you know how this works out here. Mountain handles mountain business." Martha's face went pale as winter frost. She knew exactly what those words meant. Everyone in Harland County knew what they meant. "Daniel, please think about the boys. Think about what you're asking them to become." "I am thinking about the boys. What kind of man lets someone steal $15,000 from his family and does nothing? What kind of father teaches his sons that you can be robbed blind and just accept it like some kind of whipped dog?" He turned back to watch the last sliver of sun disappear behind Black Mountain. "I gave fair warning, Martha. The rest is on them." Martha went back inside, and Daniel heard her crying in the kitchen, but he didn't follow. Some decisions a man makes alone, with only the mountains as witness. 3 days before everything fell apart, Daniel had driven into town with his youngest son, William. They'd gone to the hardware store for fence staples, stopped at the post office to check for disability checks, grabbed a lunch at the diner on Main Street. Normal things that fathers and sons had been doing in places like Harland County for generations. William was 19, still young enough to believe the future held something better than watching his hometown die a slow death. He'd been talking about joining the Army, not because he wanted to see the world or serve his country, but because it was the only ladder he could see leading up and out of the pit their community had become. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner, red vinyl cracked and patched with duct tape, a ceiling fan wobbling overhead like it might fall any second. The place smelled like grease that had been reused too many times, and coffee weak enough to see through. William ordered a cheeseburger and fries. Daniel got the meatloaf special, same thing he'd been ordering for 20 years. "Dad," William said, drowning his fries in ketchup, "you really think I should go ahead and enlist?" Daniel chewed slowly, thinking. Outside the window, Main Street sat mostly empty. Half the storefronts were boarded up with plywood. The movie theater had closed 2 years back when the owner couldn't afford to keep the lights on. Even the bank had reduced its hours because there wasn't enough business to justify staying open full time. "I think," Daniel said finally, "a man does what he has to do to take care of himself and his family, If the Army gives you a future that these mountains can't, then yeah, you should go." He met his son's eyes across the table. "But you remember where you come from. Remember what matters. Family, honor, keeping your word. Don't let them strip that out of you in boot camp." William nodded with the seriousness that only 19-year-olds can muster. "I won't, Dad, I promise." Daniel smiled and reached across to squeeze his son's shoulder. "You're a good boy, Will. Going to make something of yourself no matter where you end up." That was Thursday afternoon. On Sunday, Daniel discovered his still was gone. On Monday, he confronted Tommy Garrett, and by Tuesday evening, William would be helping load rifles into the back of his father's truck, his future in the Army evaporating before it could even begin. The preparation started before dawn on Tuesday morning. Daniel woke in darkness and drove 12 miles to his brother-in-law's place up near Evarts. Frank Howard was 62, retired from the mines with black lung so bad he needed an oxygen tank to climb stairs, but he still kept a gun collection that would make a museum curator weep with envy. Frank sat on his porch in the pre-dawn cold, breathing through clear plastic tubes when Daniel's headlights cut through the darkness. "Daniel," he wheezed. "Awful early for a social call." "Need to borrow some hardware, Frank." The old man's eyes narrowed with understanding. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know what hardware meant at 5:30 in the morning. "This about that still you mentioned? Garrett family stole from me? I gave them a chance to make it right. They chose wrong." Frank was quiet for a long time, the only sound his labored breathing and the distant cry of a screech owl hunting in the pre-dawn darkness. Finally, he struggled to his feet. "How many you figure you'll need?" "Enough for 10 men. "Sweet Jesus, Daniel." Frank shuffled inside, his slippers making soft sounds on the wooden floor. He came back 10 minutes later carrying 2 rifles, a Remington 730-06 and a Marlin lever action in .308. "These are yours to keep. Consider them a gift from family." But as he handed over the weapons, Frank gripped Daniel's arm with surprising strength. "You do this thing, Daniel, and there's no coming back. You understand that? Your boys will go to federal prison. You'll die behind bars. Martha will spend her golden years alone." Daniel met the old man's eyes without flinching. "I understand." Tommy Garrett should have returned that still. Over the next 3 days, Daniel quietly assembled an arsenal that would have impressed a military quartermaster. His own deer rifle, a Winchester Model 70. James owned a Remington shotgun he'd bought at a pawn shop. Robert had inherited their grandfather's Springfield from World War II. Michael owned a revolver he'd carried for protection since the mines started closing. The nephews who would join them each brought their own weapons, accumulated over years of deer hunting and target practice. Daniel didn't buy anything new. This was Appalachia, where firearms were as common as pickup trucks and twice as necessary. But he did purchase ammunition, spreading the buys across 4 different stores to avoid suspicion. 3 boxes of .30-06, 2 boxes of .308, 4 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot. He paid cash every time and kept every receipt in a coffee can under the kitchen sink. Some part of him still believing in documentation, in proving he'd done things legally right up until the moment he chose not to. Wednesday afternoon found Daniel spreading topographic maps across his kitchen table. Forest Service maps showing every ridge, hollow, and creek in eastern Harlan County. He'd been walking these mountains since he was 5 years old, knew them in daylight and darkness, but this kind of planning required military precision. He marked the Garrett compound with a red X, highlighted escape routes in yellow, and used blue circles to mark where each of his men would position themselves. It looked like something from his Army days, tactical planning for an operation where failure meant death or capture. James stood beside him studying the maps with growing unease. "This looks military, Dad, like something from Vietnam." "Vietnam taught me how to stay alive when people were trying to kill me," Daniel replied without looking up. "Taught me that emotion gets you caught, but planning gets you home." He tapped the map with a weathered finger. "We do this right, and nobody gets hurt who doesn't deserve it. And if they have weapons, if they fight back?" Daniel looked at his oldest son, seeing the boy who'd built model airplanes at this same table, who'd graduated high school with honors, who could have been anything if the economy hadn't collapsed around them. "Then we fight harder." At that very moment, while Daniel Turner and his sons planned their operation in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood, Tommy Garrett was working late in his garage, completely unaware that 10 men had decided he and his entire family were marked for elimination. The impact wrench screamed as he worked on a transmission. Classic rock played on a paint-splattered radio. His youngest daughter brought him a sandwich around 7 o'clock, kissed his cheek, and told him not to work too late. Normal Tuesday evening. Normal life. He went to bed that night thinking about the transmission job, about whether he could finish it by Friday, about the $80 it would bring in. He didn't think about Daniel Turner at all. Thursday evening found Daniel sitting alone in his barn, surrounded by shadows and the accumulated dust of 30 years. A single work light hung from a beam, casting everything in harsh angles. On the workbench before him lay his Winchester, disassembled for cleaning. His hands moved with automatic precision, bore brush and cleaning rod, solvent and patches. He'd cleaned this rifle 1,000 times, knew every scratch in the walnut stock, every wear mark on the blued barrel. His father had used this weapon to hunt deer every November from 1952 until cancer claimed him in 1981. Daniel had inherited it. Used it to feed his own family during the lean years when unemployment checks didn't stretch far enough. Now he was about to use it for something his father never could have imagined. To have imagined. He thought about prison, federal prison most likely. They'd charge him with murder, multiple counts, premeditated, life without parole if he was lucky, death penalty if the prosecution decided to make an example. He was 54 years old. Even if they gave him life, he'd die in a cell, never see Martha again except through reinforced glass during visiting hours, never hold grandchildren when they eventually came, never walk these mountains at dawn breathing air that smelled like pine needles and creek water. All of that gone. For copper. For $15,000. For the principle that a man doesn't let himself be robbed blind and do nothing about it. He could stop, could call Tommy Garrett right now, say, forget the whole thing, let bygones be bygones. Could drive to the sheriff's office tomorrow, file a proper report, let the law handle it the way Martha wanted. Might take months, might not go anywhere, but at least he'd stay free, stay home, stay human. But then he thought about standing in that empty clearing, staring at the rectangular patch of grass where his still had been. Thought about 2 years of work vanishing in one night. Thought about Tommy Garrett's face when he'd said he didn't know nothing about any still. The lie so casual, so easy, like Daniel's livelihood meant absolutely nothing. Thought about his sons watching, learning what their father did when someone crossed him. What kind of lesson was he teaching if he let this slide? That Turner men were pushovers? That you could steal from them and walk away laughing? Number. Some things mattered more than freedom, more than life itself. Honor, respect, the lesson that actions had consequences, that you couldn't just take what belonged to other people and expect no reckoning. Daniel reassembled the rifle with practiced efficiency, loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, and set it aside. Then he started on James's shotgun. There was no turning back now. The die had been cast the moment that still disappeared. Friday night, Daniel's sons and nephews gathered at the house for what everyone knew would be their last family dinner as free men. Martha cooked like it was Thanksgiving. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, biscuits with butter and honey. The kind of meal she made for special occasions, though nobody would call this special. They ate like normal people, talked about normal things. William mentioned a girl he'd met at the gas station in town. Robert complained about his truck's carburetor acting up again. Michael groaned about the weather turning cold, his arthritis already flaring up. Family dinner, last supper. The words hung unspoken over the table like smoke. After the meal, Daniel stood slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor that Martha had picked out 20 years ago. "Boys, nephews, go on home now, get some rest. Tomorrow night we handle our business." They all knew what that meant. Nobody asked questions. Nobody suggested alternatives. They'd been raised in these mountains, taught the old codes that predated any law written in distant capitals. When someone steals from you, you settle the debt. When someone disrespects your family, you answer. The law might not understand, but the mountains did. One by one they left. James was last, standing on the porch with his keys in his hand, looking back at his father like he was memorizing his face. "Dad, you sure about this? I mean, we could still—" "James." Daniel's voice cut through the October air like a blade. "Go home. Kiss your wife. Hold your kids. I'll see you tomorrow." James nodded, got in his truck, drove away. The taillights disappeared down the gravel driveway, swallowed by mountain darkness. Daniel stood on that porch for a long time afterward, smoking cigarettes and watching stars emerge in a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees. His breath made small clouds in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, the sound echoing off ridges and hollows before fading into silence. The mountains were so quiet you could hear Martin's Fork Creek running half a mile away, that constant whisper of water over stone that had been the soundtrack of Daniel's entire life. Martha came outside, wrapped in the cardigan sweater he'd bought her for Christmas 3 years back, when they still had money for things like Christmas presents. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him in the cold. Two people who'd shared 32 years of marriage and somehow arrived at this moment. After 5 minutes of silence that felt like hours, she spoke. "I'll wait for you. I know you will. However long it takes, 20 years, 30 years, however long they give you, I'll wait." Daniel turned to look at his wife, her face lined with age and worry. Hair gray now instead of the black it had been when they married. She'd stood by him through mining accidents, through unemployment, through the slow death of their town, and now she'd stand by him through this. He pulled her close, kissed her forehead that smelled like the lavender soap she'd been using since they were newlyweds. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Martha Jean." She was crying now. He felt the tears soaking through his flannel shirt. "Please don't do this. Please just let it go." "I can't. You won't. There's a difference." "No," Daniel said quietly, "there isn't." At 10:30, Daniel walked through the dark house one final time, checking doors that would soon be locked by federal marshals, touching walls that held 32 years of memories. He stood in the doorway of William's room. Empty now because his son was staying with cousins that night, part of the plan they'd worked out. He lingered in the bedroom he'd shared with Martha for 3 decades, breathing air that smelled like her lavender soap, and the cedar chest at the foot of the bed where she kept quilts her mother had made. He memorized everything. The wedding ring quilt spread across their bed, the photographs on the dresser showing their boys at various ages, the way moonlight came through curtains Martha had sewn herself. This was goodbye to his home, his life, everything that had made Daniel Turner who he was before he became something else entirely. Martha was sitting at the kitchen table when he came downstairs. The same table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where he'd taught his boys to tie their shoes, where he'd read them stories from books Martha checked out from the library. She didn't look up when he picked up his truck keys. Daniel walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the knob that he'd turned 10,000 times. "Martha, don't." Her voice was breaking. "Don't say anything else. Just go do what you think you have to do." Daniel walked out into the October night, started his truck. The engine sounded too loud in the mountain silence. He looked back at the house one last time, saw lights burning in the kitchen, Martha's silhouette visible through the window. He raised his hand once, didn't know if she saw it, then put the truck in gear and drove toward the rendezvous point where 9 other men were waiting with rifles, and the shared understanding that by sunrise, nothing would ever be the same again. The meeting spot was a clearing 2 miles from the Garrett compound, hidden from the road by a stand of white pines that had been growing there since before Daniel was born. When he arrived at 11:30, 9 other vehicles were already there, dark shapes in darker shadows. His sons, his nephews, all armed, all ready to cross the line that separated civilized men from something much older and more dangerous. They stood in the cold mountain air, breath steaming like ghosts, waiting for their father and uncle to give the order that would transform them from coal miners and mechanics and unemployed laborers into something history would remember with horror. Daniel climbed out of his truck, looked at these men he'd raised and helped raise, good men who were about to throw their lives away because he'd asked them to, because family meant more than law, because honor mattered more than freedom, because some insults couldn't be swallowed, some thefts couldn't be forgiven, some debts could only be paid in blood. The fog was rolling down from Black Mountain now, thick and cold, turning the forest into something from a nightmare. Through the trees ahead, maybe 400 yards distant, Daniel could see the Garrett compound. 3 trailers arranged in a rough triangle, a single security light casting long shadows across the clearing. Through one window, the blue flicker of a television. Saturday night, families at home, settling in for the evening, completely unaware that 10 armed men were moving through the darkness toward them. Daniel picked up his Winchester, checked the chamber one final time, breathed the mountain air deep into his lungs. His hands were steady. That surprised him. He'd expected them to shake, expected some physical manifestation of what he was about to become. Instead, he felt nothing but cold purpose, like he'd already stepped outside himself and was watching Daniel Turner from a great distance. "Last chance to walk away from this," James said quietly from beside him. Daniel looked at his oldest son, the boy who'd been born while Daniel was serving in Korea, who'd grown up to be a better man than his father ever was, who was about to destroy his future because Daniel had decided honor mattered more than freedom. "We're past that point, son. Been past it since they stole what was ours." James nodded slowly. "Then, let's finish this thing." Daniel opened his truck door, the dome light disabled hours earlier. 9 other doors opened simultaneously. 10 men, armed and silent, moving through fog and darkness like the ghosts they were about to become. They'd rehearsed this operation, knew their positions, understood their roles. Daniel and James would take the main trailer where Tommy Garrett lived with his wife and children. Robert and Michael would handle the second trailer. David and Thomas would secure the third. The nephews would form a perimeter, cutting off escape routes, handling anyone who tried to run. Military precision. Vietnam had taught Daniel that chaos gets you caught, but discipline gets you home. Tonight, discipline would get 14 men killed and 10 Turners sentenced to life in federal prison. A fair trade, in Daniel's mind. Some principles were worth any price. They moved through the forest without speaking. using hand signals Daniel had learned 35 years ago in a jungle on the other side of the world. The temperature kept dropping. Frost was forming on dead leaves, crunching under their boots despite their efforts to move quietly. Behind him, James breathed steadily, controlled, ready. His son had always been good under pressure. At 11:52, they reached the tree line. The Garrett compound sat in a clearing maybe 50 yards across, exposed under that security light that buzzed with insects despite the October cold. From the main trailer, Daniel could hear laughter. Television audience, probably some sitcom rerun. From the second trailer came music, a country station playing something by Merle Haggard. The third trailer was dark, silent. Daniel raised his hand. Everyone froze, listening, watching, waiting. No dogs. The Garretts had kept 3 dogs, but Daniel's nephew Frank had handled that problem earlier with poisoned meat left by the side of the road. Cruel, but necessary. Dogs bark, barking alerts neighbors, and this needed to happen fast and quiet. Daniel lowered his hand. The signal to move. At 11:55, they crossed that clearing like shadows, 10 men with rifles spreading out according to the plan they'd practiced in Daniel's barn. This was it. The moment when Daniel Turner stopped being a coal miner and became something that would haunt these mountains forever. Daniel reached the aluminum door of the main trailer first, his Winchester gripped tight in hands that had once held his newborn son's. The metal was cold under his palm, cold as the October air that bit at his lungs with each breath. This was the final moment, the last possible second to turn around, to wake the Garretts and tell them he'd changed his mind, to walk away without blood on his hands. Instead, he opened the door. Tommy Garrett sat on a worn couch that had seen better decades, a beer in one hand, eyes fixed on the television screen. He turned at the sound of the door opening, saw Daniel standing there with the rifle, and understanding crept across his face like frost forming on glass. First confusion, then recognition, then the terrible knowledge of what was about to happen. "Daniel," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell are you doing?" "You had your chance," Daniel replied, his voice flat and empty as a grave. "Deadline was 4 o'clock. Sun went down 6 hours ago." Tommy started to rise from the couch, his beer bottle falling to the floor and shattering on cheap linoleum. The Winchester barked once, cutting through the night like thunder. Tommy fell backward, his body crashing over the couch, blood spreading across the floor, while the television continued playing its canned laughter to an audience that would never laugh again. From the bedroom came screaming. Susan Garrett, Tommy's wife, her voice raw with terror and disbelief. James moved toward the hallway, but Daniel grabbed his arm with fingers that felt like iron clamps. "Women and children don't get touched," Daniel said. "That's the line we don't cross. She saw us, Dad. She can identify every one of us." "Women and children," Daniel repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Ah, that's how we stay human in this thing." They left Susan screaming in the bedroom and moved to the second trailer, where Bobby Garrett was making a late-night sandwich in his kitchen. Bologna and cheese, mayonnaise spread across the counter, the mundane details of a life about to end. He wore pajama pants and a high school football t-shirt, 28 years old, dreaming of opening his own repair shop someday. He turned when they entered, saw the rifles, and dropped the knife he was holding. It clattered on the floor like bones falling. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Daniel, this is completely insane." "Your brother stole from me," Daniel said. "You stood by and let it happen. I didn't know nothing about any still. I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't know." "You're a Garrett. That makes you guilty." Bobby backed toward the sink, hands raised, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes when death walks through your kitchen door. "Man, please. I got 2 little girls. They're sleeping right there." He pointed toward a closed bedroom door. "They're babies." Daniel felt something crack in his chest. Little girls, innocent as morning dew, sleeping while their father begged for his life. He looked at James, who was staring at that bedroom door with an expression Daniel couldn't read. "You got 30 seconds to say goodbye," Daniel said. Bobby's face went white as winter snow. "You can't just—" 25 seconds. Bobby stumbled toward the bedroom door, opened it with shaking hands. Daniel heard children's voices, sleepy and confused. Heard Bobby's voice breaking as he told them he loved them, told them to stay in their room no matter what they heard, told them to be brave for Daddy. The door closed. Bobby came back out, tears streaming down his face like rain on windows. "They're babies, Daniel. You do this, you make them orphans." "Should have thought about that before your family crossed me." "I didn't cross you, Tommy did." Daniel's rifle cut him off mid-sentence. Bobby Garrett fell beside his unfinished sandwich, mayonnaise spreading across the counter like spilled milk. The refrigerator hummed its electric song. From the bedroom, one of the girls started crying, a sound that would haunt Daniel's dreams for whatever remained of his life. Outside, the fog had thickened until you could barely see 20 feet in any direction. Daniel heard gunshots from the third trailer, Robert and Michael handling their assigned targets. More shots, shouting. Then the kind of silence that follows violence like shadows follow light. At 12:17, Daniel found himself standing in the mechanic's garage behind the main trailer. Wayne Garrett was there, 26 years old, newest father in the family, working late on a carburetor because he needed the money and couldn't afford to turn down rush jobs. His back was to the door when Daniel entered. Wayne turned with a wrench in his hand, saw Daniel, and actually smiled like he thought this was some kind of neighborly visit. "Daniel, kinda late for a house call, ain't it?" The smile died when he saw the Winchester. "Oh God, oh Jesus, no." Wayne dropped the wrench, the metal clanging on concrete like a funeral bell. "Daniel, please, I got a baby, 8 months old. Little girl named Emma. I know," Daniel said. And he did know. He'd seen the baby at the grocery store 2 weeks ago, cute as a button, with her mother showing her off to everyone who'd look. "Then how can you do this? 'Cause this is bigger than one baby. This is about my family, my sons, my legacy. You Garretts took that from me." Wayne's hands were shaking like leaves in a storm. "We didn't take nothing. Your brother stole $15,000 worth of equipment from me. Equipment that fed my family. And when I gave him a chance to make it right, he spit in my face. I work at the garage. I fix cars. I don't know nothing about moonshine. You're a Garrett, that's enough." Wayne tried to run, made it maybe 3 steps before Daniel's shot dropped him beside a '79 Chevy with the hood open and tools scattered across the engine block. The radio on the workbench kept playing. Hank Williams singing about being so lonesome he could cry. Daniel stood there, rifle still raised, looking at a 26-year-old man who would never see his daughter turn one. He waited for guilt, for horror, for anything human. Felt only the cold satisfaction of another name crossed off his list. While Daniel moved through the Garrett compound with mechanical efficiency, 4 miles away, an elderly couple from Ohio slept peacefully at the bed and breakfast on Main Street. They'd come to Kentucky for the fall colors, to see the mountains in their October glory, to hike trails and take photographs. Tomorrow they'd wake to pancakes and coffee, completely unaware that while they dreamed of autumn leaves, 14 men were being eliminated in the darkness beyond town. At 12:28, Carl Garrett woke on a couch in the third trailer when Robert kicked the door open. Carl was 45, Tommy's uncle, a Vietnam veteran like Daniel. He'd been at Khe Sanh in '68, same year Daniel was at Da Nang. Different battles, same war, and they'd bonded over that once at a county fair, talking about things only soldiers understood. Carl saw the shotgun, didn't reach for the .38 special on the coffee table, knew he'd be dead before his fingers touched metal. "Turner," Carl said. Not a question, just acknowledgement. "Carl." A long moment of silence stretched between them. Two veterans who'd survived a war together now on opposite sides of something uglier than anything they'd faced in Southeast Asia. "You really going to do this? Over copper?" "It was never about the copper," Robert said. "It was about respect. Tommy was an idiot, whole family knows it. But you're killing all of us for one man's mistake. You're a Garrett, that's the mistake." Carl's face hardened with the kind of resolve that only comes from staring death in the face and finding peace with it. "You know what they'll do to you boys for this? Federal prison, life sentences. You'll die in cages." "I know. Then why?" "Because my father asked. Because family matters. Because when someone crosses a Turner, they pay." Carl reached for his pistol, slow and deliberate, giving Robert every chance to stop this madness. Robert didn't take it. The shotgun blast cut Carl down mid-reach, and he fell sideways off the couch while the .38 remained on the table, untouched and useless. Outside, Daniel was counting bodies, checking names off an invisible list. 7 down, 7 to go. 3 men remained who at that moment were waking to the sound of gunfire, completely unaware that running would only delay the inevitable by minutes. Marcus Garrett, 19 years old, bolted from the third trailer wearing nothing but boxer shorts and a t-shirt, barefoot, running blind through fog and darkness. He made it maybe 200 yards before Samuel Turner caught him at the tree line. Marcus fell to his knees in dead leaves, hands raised like he was surrendering to an army instead of one man with a rifle. "Please," he gasped. "I'm just a kid. I ain't done nothing to nobody." Samuel looked down at him, 5 years older, but feeling ancient in that moment. "You're a Garrett? That ain't my fault. I didn't choose my family." "Neither did we." Marcus tried to stand, tried to run again. Samuel's rifle spoke once, and Marcus fell forward into the leaves and didn't move again. Fog swirled around his body like spirits mourning the dead. At 1:03, Daniel and James found Kevin Garrett in the second trailer, trying to load a hunting rifle with hands that shook so badly he kept dropping the shells. 29 years old, father of 3 boys, all of them sleeping in the back bedroom while their father fumbled with death. The rifle clattered to the floor when he saw them enter. "Daniel, Jesus, Daniel, please." Too late for praying. "I got 3 kids, 3 boys. You do this, they grow up without a father. Should have thought about that before your family stole from me. I didn't steal nothing from nobody. You're a Garrett." Kevin dropped to his knees, actually begged with tears running down his face like he was praying to some merciless God. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll pay you back. I'll work for free. You'll die like the rest of your family." James hesitated, looked at his father with something like doubt flickering in his eyes. "Dad, maybe we don't have to—" "James, do your job." James raised the rifle. Kevin closed his eyes and started praying, his voice breaking on every word. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The shot cut him off mid-prayer. Daniel watched his son lower the rifle and saw something die in James's eyes, something that would never come back. His boy had killed before, deer mostly, but never a man. Never someone begging on their knees. That kind of killing changed you, made you into something your mother wouldn't recognize. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to James or to Kevin's corpse or to the 3 boys who would wake up fatherless. James didn't respond, just walked out into the fog. Daniel stood alone in that trailer, surrounded by the evidence of a family's life. Photographs on the walls, children's drawings on the refrigerator, a birthday cake in a box on the counter. Kevin's body on the floor, blood spreading across worn linoleum. The fog was so thick now that Daniel could barely see his own boots. He heard more shots in the distance, his boys finishing their work. Someone screamed. Then silence fell over the compound like a burial shroud. At 1:15, Daniel sat on the steps of the main trailer, Winchester across his knees, and felt his hands shake for the first time that night. Not from fear, but from the terrible understanding that he'd crossed a line no human being should cross, become something worse than the people he'd always feared and despised. Around him, October night continued unchanged. Wind moved through trees that had watched these mountains for centuries. Fog rolled down from ridges that would outlive every human name carved into their stone. Stars shone cold and indifferent through breaks in the clouds. The universe didn't care that Daniel Turner had just destroyed 14 families. It just kept turning, indifferent to human pain and human choices and human consequences. At 1:33, Daniel found the last 3 Garrett men hiding together in the mechanic's garage. Raymond, Douglas, and Frank Jr., cousins who decided to make their final stand together rather than die alone. They had 2 rifles and a shotgun between them, crouched behind that Chevy truck Wayne had been working on, using it as cover against the inevitable. "Turner!" Raymond shouted into the fog. "You killed enough people tonight. Just leave us be. We won't tell nobody nothing." Daniel stepped into the garage, his boots crunching on metal shavings and broken glass. Behind him, all 9 Turner men spread out, surrounding the building like hunters closing in on cornered prey. "Can't do that, Raymond." "Why not? You got your revenge. You proved your point." "Haven't finished yet." "We didn't do nothing to you. You're Garrett's, that's enough." Raymond raised his rifle, and so did Douglas. Frank Jr. held the shotgun with trembling hands that betrayed his 19 years. "You'll have to go through us then," Raymond said, his voice steady despite everything. "I know." For a moment, nobody moved. 3 Garretts, 10 Turners, the outcome as inevitable as sunrise. But Raymond had pride, had honor, the same code Daniel operated under. The code that said, you don't go quiet into that good night. You fight back. You make them pay for every inch. "Hell of a thing," Raymond said, dying over copper. "It was never about the copper," Daniel replied. "It was about respect, about looking me in the eye like I was nothing, about me asking for what was mine and getting lies in return." "So this makes you the good guy, killing 14 people?" "No, but it makes me the man who fought back, who didn't roll over and take it like some beaten dog." They looked at each other across that garage that smelled of oil and metal shavings. 2 men who'd lived in the same county their whole lives, who'd shared the same mountains and the same hard times, now facing each other over rifle sights in a mechanic's shop that would become a slaughterhouse. "I'm sorry it came to this," Daniel said, and meant it. "No, you're not," Raymond replied, and he was right. They fired simultaneously. 3 Garretts against 10 Turners, muzzle flashes lighting up the garage like lightning strikes, bullets punching through metal and shattering windows and tearing through wooden walls. The fight lasted maybe 10 seconds but felt like hours. Thunder and flame, and the smell of gunpowder mixing with motor oil. When the echoes faded, Raymond and Douglas and Frank Jr. lay on the concrete floor, blood mixing with oil stains that had been there since the garage was built. The radio was still playing, someone singing about whiskey and heartbreak and lonesome nights. Daniel stood there, rifle still raised, looking at 3 men he'd known his entire life, waited for guilt, for horror, for something human. Felt nothing but exhaustion so complete it seemed to reach down into his bones and settle there like lead. 1:38 in the morning. 14 men were dead. The worst mass elimination in Appalachian history was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Daniel walked back through fog to his truck, his boots leaving prints in frost-covered grass that someone would follow later. That would lead investigators right back to him. Didn't matter. He wasn't running from this. Behind him, his sons and nephews emerged from the compound like ghosts materializing from mist. All of them silent, all of them changed forever in ways that couldn't be undone. William was crying. Michael looked like he might be sick. James's face had gone completely blank, the expression soldiers get when they've seen too much death, and their minds shut down to protect what's left of their humanity. Daniel climbed into his truck, placed the Winchester on the passenger seat beside him. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and he looked at his palms, stained with gunpowder residue and something darker. These hands had built fences and changed diapers, and held Martha when she cried about her brothers dying in the mines. Now they were a killer's hands, and they would be killer's hands for whatever remained of his life. James climbed into the passenger seat, William and Robert into the back, all of them smelling of gunpowder and death and choices that couldn't be taken back. "Dad," James said quietly, his voice hollow as an empty grave, "what do we do now?" Daniel stared at the dark forest where dawn would break in a few hours, where the world would wake up to discover what they'd done, where federal agents would come with helicopters and dogs, and warrants that would end their lives as surely as bullets had ended the Garretts. "We go home," he said. "We clean up, we wait for them to come, and then we face what we did." Daniel started the engine, and they drove away through fog and darkness. 10 men who'd crossed the line that separates human beings from monsters, carrying the weight of 14 dead and knowing they'd carry it for the rest of their lives. The blood had been shed, the debt had been paid, and in 6 hours, when a Kentucky state trooper would discover the first body, Harlan County would wake to learn what happens when mountain justice collides with federal law in the darkness of the Cumberland Mountains. But for now, they drove in silence through a world that had changed forever, past sleeping houses where families dreamed peacefully, unaware that their neighbors had just written their names in blood across the pages of Appalachian history. The fog rolled on, the mountains kept their ancient watch, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed 2 o'clock, marking time in a place where time had just run out for 14 men and the 10 who'd killed them. 6 hours after the last shot echoed through the Cumberland Mountains, Kentucky State Trooper Gary Henderson pulled his patrol car onto a logging road 3 miles east of Clovertown. He'd received a routine call about an abandoned truck blocking the road. Probably hunters, probably nothing serious, just another quiet October morning in Harlan County. Gary was 28 years old, 6 months out of the academy, still young enough to believe that police work in rural Kentucky meant writing speeding tickets and breaking up Saturday night bar fights. He'd grown up in Lexington, requested assignment to the mountains because he wanted adventure, wanted to see the real Kentucky that tourists never visited. He stepped out of his cruiser at 6:47 in the morning. Temperature was 41 degrees. Fog still thick in the hollows. His breath making small clouds in the air as he approached the abandoned Ford Ranger. Passenger door hanging open, keys dangling from the ignition. Then he saw the body. Wayne Garrett lay on his back beside the truck, eyes open and staring at nothing. A dark stain spreading across his Harlan County High School t-shirt. Flies had already found him despite the cold. Gary's training kicked in automatically. Check for pulse, secure the scene, call for backup. But his hands were shaking so badly he dropped his radio twice before getting it to his mouth. He'd never seen a dead body outside a funeral home, never seen what a bullet does to human flesh and bone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I have a—" His voice cracked like a teenager's. He tried again. "I have a body. Male, gunshot wound. Logging Road 7, 3 miles east of Clovertown. I need backup now." By 7:30, more calls flooded the dispatch center. Susan Garrett had run 2 miles through forest in her nightgown, barefoot, bleeding from cuts on her feet where thorns had torn her skin. She stumbled onto Route 421 and flagged down a pickup truck driven by Howard Mills, who was heading to church. She was screaming about bodies, about the Turners, about her husband eliminated in front of her while she hid in the bedroom closet with her daughters. Her words came out in broken fragments between sobs, but Howard Mills understood enough to know that something terrible had happened in the darkness. At 8:15, a jogger named Patricia Dean discovered Bobby Garrett's trailer while following her usual Sunday morning route. The front door stood wide open, which struck her as odd since most mountain folks kept their doors closed against the October chill. She called out, got no response, peered inside, and saw the body sprawled beside an unfinished sandwich. From a closed bedroom came the sound of children crying, small voices calling for their daddy who would never answer again. Patricia backed away slowly, made it to her car, locked the doors with trembling fingers, and called 911 while listening to those children cry, too terrified to go back inside and comfort them. While Gary Henderson processed Wayne Garrett's crime scene with hands that still trembled, while Susan Garrett gave her statement through tears and shock, while Patricia Dean sat in her car, unable to stop hearing those children's voices, 40 miles away in Harlan, the Sunday morning crowd filled Betty's restaurant on Main Street. Biscuits and gravy, country ham and eggs, coffee refilled every 5 minutes by waitresses who'd been working there since the Carter administration. The early church crowd dressed in their Sunday best, talking about the weather turning cold, about whether the Wildcats would make it to a bowl game, about normal things that normal people discuss over normal Sunday breakfast. Nobody knew yet that 14 families would never be whole again. Nobody knew that the worst mass killing in Appalachian history had happened just a few miles away while they slept. Pancakes and prayer, life continuing, oblivious to death. Harlan County Sheriff Randall Pierce was 56 years old with 32 years wearing the badge. He'd dealt with moonshine busts that turned violent, domestic disputes that ended in tragedy, bar fights that left men bleeding in parking lots. He'd pulled bodies from mine collapses and car wrecks, seen poverty grind people down until they did desperate things. But when his dispatcher called him at home at 7:45 and said there were reports of multiple bodies near Clovertown, he knew this was different. This wasn't some Saturday night fight that got out of hand or a domestic situation gone wrong. This was something that would change his county forever. He arrived at the Garrett compound at 8:30 to find FBI Special Agent Raymond Cross already there, called in from Knoxville the moment the body count exceeded 3. Cross was 47 with 20 years in the Bureau, had investigated everything from bank robberies to domestic terrorism, but even he stood slack-jawed at what they found. Pierce discovered Tommy Garrett first, then Bobby, then Wayne, then Carl. Marcus in the woods, Kevin in the second trailer, then the 3 in the garage. 9 bodies in one location, 5 more scattered through the surrounding forest like some twisted treasure hunt where the prize was death. Sheriff Pierce, who'd known Tommy Garrett since the man was in diapers, stood in the center of that compound and felt his understanding of Harlan County shift fundamentally. This wasn't moonshine violence. Wasn't a feud escalating slowly over years of accumulated grudges. This was systematic, planned, executed with military precision that spoke to training and discipline. By noon, the FBI had transformed the Garrett compound into a command center. Evidence markers everywhere like tiny flags marking a battlefield. photographers documenting everything, medical examiner beginning the grim work of body collection. Agent Cross walked the perimeter, studying angles, reconstructing events with the methodical approach of someone who'd seen too much human darkness. "Sheriff," Cross said, crouching beside shell casings near the garage, "I count at least 8 different weapons, multiple calibers, multiple shooters. This wasn't passion, wasn't rage. Rage is chaotic and sloppy. This was coordinated." Pierce nodded grimly. Daniel Turner served in Vietnam, got military training. Some of his sons did time in the service, too. "How many Turners we talking about?" "Daniel, 6 sons, 4 nephews. That's 11 men, all adults, all capable of handling firearms." Cross stood up, looked at the 3 trailers, then at the forest beyond where fog still clung to the hollows like ghosts refusing to leave. "Timeline puts this between midnight and 2 in the morning. Susan Garrett says they came around midnight, heard Tommy eliminated first. After that, chaos, shots from multiple directions. She hid in the bedroom closet with her daughters, saved their lives. So we're looking at what, 2 hours maybe? These weren't random hits. They knew exactly where everyone was, who to target, how to move through the compound. Someone planned this like a military operation. Over the next 48 hours, investigators worked around the clock. They interviewed everyone in Harlan County who knew either family, analyzed shell casings and bullet trajectories, studied tire tracks in the frost-covered grass. The pattern that emerged was as clear as mountain spring water and twice as cold. Evidence recovered showed 73 shell casings total, a mix of .30-06 rifle, .308 rifle, 12-gauge shotgun, .357 Magnum revolver. Ballistics confirmed they came from at least 8 different weapons, all hunting firearms, all legally owned in Harlan County. The timeline was tight as a noose. Approximately 11:45 Saturday night to 1:40 Sunday morning. Less than 2 hours for 14 eliminations across multiple locations. That kind of efficiency required planning, coordination, and the cold discipline that comes from military training. The suspects were obvious. Daniel Turner and family. Witnesses had heard Daniel's ultimatum in town. 3 people confirmed his exact words: "Return what's mine by sundown October 11th, or we settle this mountain style." But it was the motive that stunned everyone involved in the investigation. Deputy Sheriff Mike Bradley found it Tuesday morning in Daniel Turner's kitchen, tucked inside a coffee can under the sink. Receipts for ammunition purchases spread across 4 different stores, and a handwritten note dated October 9th. "They stole my still, $15,000, took my family's livelihood, gave them fair warning. They chose this." That was it. 14 men eliminated over a moonshine, still worth $15,000. Agent Cross stood in the Turner kitchen holding that note and felt something close to disbelief wash over him like cold water. $15,000, he said aloud. That's what this was about. Sheriff Pierce sat at the kitchen table, where the Turner family had shared thousands of meals, looking 20 years older than he had Sunday morning. It wasn't about the money. It was about respect, about mountain code. You don't steal from a man's family and walk away laughing. That's not a legal defense. No, but it's an explanation. Pierce looked at Cross with eyes that had seen too much of human nature's dark side. "You're not from here. You don't understand how these mountains work. There's law, and then there's code. Sometimes the code matters more. Not to federal prosecutors it doesn't. No, I know that." Pierce stood up, walked to the window where he could see Martha Turner sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. Her husband and sons were about to be arrested, her life about to end in every way that mattered. But ask yourself this, Agent Cross. If someone stole $15,000 from you, and the law was 40 miles away and didn't care, and you had to watch your family starve, what would you do? Cross didn't answer because they both knew the uncomfortable truth. Most people were closer to Daniel Turner's breaking point than they wanted to admit. By Tuesday evening, news of the massacre had spread beyond Harland County. State media picked it up first, then national networks arrived Wednesday morning. CNN, ABC, NBC, all descending on a small Appalachian town to cover the worst mass killing in Kentucky history. The community split immediately down lines that had been drawn generations before anyone alive could remember. At Betty's restaurant, conversations grew heated enough that the owner had to ask folks to keep their voices down or take their arguments outside. Some said Daniel Turner was a monster who'd slaughtered 14 innocent men in cold blood. Others said he was a desperate father driven to extreme measures by thieves who'd violated every code the mountains held sacred. "I ain't saying what he did was right," Earl Hopkins told a reporter from the Lexington Herald-Leader. Earl owned the hardware store, had known Daniel for 40 years, had sold him fence staples and work gloves, and treated him like the decent man everyone thought he was. "But I understand it. Man works his whole life, economy collapses, coal industry dies, and then someone steals the one thing keeping his family fed. Something's going to break in a man's heart when that happens." The Garrett family survivors demanded maximum punishment, death penalty if possible. No mercy for the men who'd eliminated their fathers, brothers, sons, but quietly, privately, more than a few Harland County residents admitted they understood Daniel's rage, even if they couldn't condone his actions. The code ran deep in these mountains, deeper than federal law, deeper than Christian forgiveness. Theft of livelihood was still, in some minds, worthy of the ultimate punishment. At Harlan Baptist Church the Sunday after the massacre, Pastor William Crawford struggled through his sermon like a man trying to explain the unexplainable. "We ask God why," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Why this violence? Why couldn't neighbors settle their differences without bloodshed? Why did mountain justice have to mean mountain slaughter?" He had no answers, just grief and the terrible knowledge that his congregation would be defined by this horror for generations to come. Some families would never speak to each other again. Others would leave entirely, unable to live in a place where such darkness could erupt from ordinary disputes. The town was divided, and everyone knew that whatever verdict eventually came, Harland County would carry this scar forever, passed down through generations like family names and inherited debts. On Wednesday, October 18th, 7 days after the massacre, FBI agents, state police, and sheriff's deputies approached the Turner property with enough firepower to handle a small war. 20 officers in body armor, rifles at the ready, expecting maybe a standoff, maybe a final shootout to end the whole bloody chapter. What they found was Daniel Turner sitting on his front porch, unarmed, hands visible on his knees. His 6 sons stood behind him in a line, 4 nephews beside them, all unarmed, all calm, waiting for the inevitable with the same grim determination mountain people brought to all of life's harsh realities. "Sheriff Pierce," Daniel said as Randall Pierce got out of his vehicle. "Figured you'd be coming around about Saturday night. Daniel, I need you and your boys to come with us." The Turner family massacre stands as one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, a testament to what happens when desperation meets honor in a world where both the law and hope have abandoned entire communities. Daniel Turner and his sons paid the ultimate price for their version of mountain justice, spending decades behind bars for 14 lives taken in a single blood-soaked night. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the thin line between protecting what's ours and becoming the very monsters we fear. In a place where federal law meant nothing and survival meant everything. 10 men chose violence over surrender, honor over freedom, and in doing so destroyed not just their victims' families but their own. The mountains still remember that October night, and perhaps they always will, because some debts once paid in blood can never truly be settled.